All right, guys, we are officially starting our next unit, which is going to be all about plants. And I know you guys are probably getting tired. You've been working hard. You're getting ready for spring break. But I'm just going to ask that you hang with me, you keep on working. We really only have two more major concepts to cover, and that is going to be our plants and our animals. So we are almost there. We are nearing the finish line, so just keep on trucking. I think you guys are doing a great job so far, so just stay with me. So this particular lesson is going to cover the kind of basics of our next kingdom, which is going to be Kingdom Plantae or Kingdom Plantae. You can say it however you want. But essentially we're going to look at our next group of eukaryotes. So we started off with our prokaryotic kingdoms. We looked at Kingdom Bacteria and Kingdom Archaea. Then we moved into domain Eukarya. We took a look at protists, which are kind of like the misfit kingdom. We took a look at fungi, which are going to be our mostly multicellular heterotrophs that have chitin in their cell walls. And now we're moving up into our next group, which is going to be our plants. Now our focus is going to be on land plants. There obviously are plants that are in the water, but primarily we are going to be talking about terrestrial plants because most of them are terrestrial. And the reason for that is the conditions are better suited for those plants on land. There's better sunlight, more carbon dioxide available, the soils are better, and so most of our plants are going to be land plants, and that is where we will pretty much put all of our focus. Now, in general, some of the characteristics that put an organism into this kingdom is that they are going to be eukaryotic. So of course we are still in domain eukarya, and so by being eukaryotic we should know by now that this means they have nuclei, they have internal membrane organelles like mitochondria and chloroplast, and so they're going to be these more complex cells. One thing that you'll find is that all plants are multicellular. So where fungi, they were mostly multicellular, in Kingdom Plantae, they are going to be multicellular. If it's a unicellular organism, it's not going to be fitting into this kingdom. Okay, it would most likely be a plant-like protist or an algae. So as we mentioned, they're mostly terrestrial. And here's another defining characteristic of plants, and that is the cell wall composition. So we've seen that cell wall is kind of important. In terms of our prokaryotes, we saw peptidoglycan. In terms of our fungi, we saw chitin. And then in plants, their cell walls are composed of cellulose. Now this is a substance that we commonly call fiber. So when you eat plant material, we don't really have the proper enzymes for digesting cellulose. And so this is what we call fiber. It kind of helps in your digestive tract. And so cellulose is just a polysaccharide that makes up the cell wall of that plant cell. Another important characteristic is that plants are mostly autotrophic. There's a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, your plants are going to be photosynthetic producers. And they are able to do that because they contain the organelles known as chloroplast, which contain the pigment known as chlorophyll, which is what gives the plants their green color and their ability to perform photosynthesis. Now, a little bit of evolutionary history. In order for plants to evolve, they had to kind of develop some mechanisms that allowed them to survive on land and reproduce more successfully. They are believed to have evolved from a green algae group millions of years ago. And as we're going to see as we move through our different plant groups, we're going to see an increase in these reproductive adaptations and other ways that help the plant survive better. And so the first thing that you're going to see is some embryo protection. They're going to be protected in possibly seeds, or they're going to be protected in a type of structure that will prevent them from drying out or being exposed to the elements. So the embryo would just be the baby plant. We're going to see development of vascular tissue. And we're not really going to go into the details of this vascular tissue in this lesson. We'll focus more on the details of it in a future lesson. but the vascular tissue is all about transport. We're going to look at the development of megaphylls, and so this is going to be the large leaves. Our earlier plants are not going to have big leaves with a large surface area. One of the advancements we're going to see as we go through our plant groups is the development of seeds, which is going to house not only the embryo but also a food source, and it's going to be in a protective coat, and it's going to allow for dispersal. And then we have the development of flowers, which are specialized reproductive structures. And so we're going to see kind of this general transition into more and more complex plants. So here's kind of your phylogenetic tree. This is one example. And honestly, if you can kind of understand a phylogenetic tree like this, this will greatly help you understand the plant groups that we're about to discuss. So we can see that here's our green algae ancestor. The first land plants would have been our simpler plants like mosses. Notice they do not have vascular tissue, they do not have seeds, they do not have flowers. All of these things came after. The next group would be your vascular plants, but notice they don't have seeds and flowers. The next groups would be your seed plants, and then the most advanced plant group would be those that have flowers, because as you can see, they have flowers, they have seeds, they have vascular tissue. Okay, so this is kind of our general progression, and this is how we're going to go about learning our diversity in land plants. Now, one thing that they all have in common, regardless of whether they have seeds or whether they have pollen or whether or not they have vascular tissue, is these land plants demonstrate a life cycle known as alternation of generations. And what this is talking about is it alternates between two multicellular stages. Okay, so we have the gametophyte stage and the sporophyte stage. You should have been introduced to this in your videos that you watched yesterday, but this is something that we're going to see throughout all plant groups. Now, they each have their own slightly different versions, but in a plant life cycle, they alternate between a multicellular gametophyte and a multicellular sporophyte. Now, if you look outside at the plants growing, outside of your school, outside of your home, as you drive down interstate, when you're looking at most plants, what you're looking at is the sporophyte. So when you think about a tree, or you think about a flower, or you just think about grass, this is going to be the sporophyte generation. Okay. Now, sometimes these gametophytes are smaller and hidden, but at some point in the life cycle of the plant, they will have a multicellular gametophyte and a multicellular sporophyte. Now, some things that you need to know about these are going to be their number of chromosomes, okay? And so we're going to see these words like haploid and diploid again. We haven't seen these in a while, okay? Back in meiosis, we learned about haploid having half the number of chromosomes, and diploid or diploid having 2 sets of chromosomes. So like in terms of humans, remember that our gametes were haploid and they had 23, and then our body cells were diploid and they had 46. Okay, so the same thing applies here. We have either 1 set or 2 sets. So often you're going to see the abbreviations for these as either 1N or 2N. Okay, now this part should be easy to remember. The gametophyte produces the gametes, okay, and the sporophyte produces spores. So that part isn't too hard. There's a little bit more complexity to that, but the gametophyte is haploid and produces gametes. Those gametes are going to fuse, and they're going to produce the diploid sporophyte, which will then go on to produce the spores. And then the spores will become the gametophyte, which produces the gametes, which fuse to form the sporophyte, which produces the spores, which forms the gametophyte, and so on, and so on, and so on. So like I said, when you're looking at a plant, you're most likely looking at the sporophyte. Okay, the tree is the sporophyte, the flower is the sporophyte, the bush is the sporophyte. Okay, now up here in the gametophyte, this is your gamete producing structure. Well, kind of like we have male and female parts that produce the male and female gametes, so do the plants. And in the case of these parts, we have the archegonia and the antheridia. Okay, so the archegonia, I want you to notice these letters here. Archegonia. This is going to be the female gametophyte that produces the eggs. And then the antheridia, notice it has the ER, that's going to be the male that produces the sperm, which also has that ER. Okay, so the archegonia is the female gametophyte, and the antheridia is the male gametophyte. And then down here, when we look at our sporophyte, they're producing the spores. We have mega and micro. Now I want you to think about an egg versus a sperm. Eggs are some of the biggest cells that you will find in an organism. So mega means big and micro means small. So your megaspores are the ones that will become the female gametophyte, which will produce the eggs, and the micro are will become the male gametophyte that will produce the tiny sperm. Okay, so maybe that'll help you remember those as well. And so this is what the alternation of generations looks like. Now this is just kind of a generic one. As I'm going to show you as we go through our lesson, we're going to see some slight variations of this, but they all show the same basic pattern. Okay, it doesn't matter where you start, it's a cycle. So I'm going to start up here with the gametophyte. Okay, now remember that the gametophyte stage is haploid, so it's represented by one N, and the gametophyte is going to produce the gametes. All right, so technically we're going from a haploid gametophyte to haploid gametes. Okay, and so this is going to happen through the process of mitosis. When those gametes fuse together, we have haploid plus haploid. That's going to produce a diploid zygote. Okay, so notice down here we're in the diploid stages. That zygote is going to undergo mitosis to produce the multicellular sporophyte, which is also diploid. Okay, then that sporophyte will undergo meiosis. That's your chromosome dividing process. And so it's going to produce spores that are actually haploid. Okay, so because we're going through meiosis here, this diploid sporophyte is going to produce haploid spores because they're going to undergo meiosis. And then these spores are then going to go through mitosis to form the haploid gametophyte, and it starts all over. Okay, so at some point in a plant's life, you will have both stages. Okay. All right, now what we're going to do for most of the rest of our notes is go through these four main plant groups. Okay, we're going to break them down into non-vascular plants, seedless vascular plants, and then we have two groups of seed plants, which are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So we're going to start with the simplest, most basic, and I guess the first group coming from those green algae ancestors, and that's going to be our non-vascular plants, or what are commonly called bryophytes. Okay, now you probably recognize this word. Most people are familiar with mosses. So your bryophytes are going to be your very simplistic looking land plants. They look very algae-like in some cases, but some other examples are liverworts and hornworts, and they just look a little differently. They have a little bit different of a structure to them. Now these are going to be different from the rest of our land plants in that they don't have true roots, stems, and leaves. And the reason is because they are non-vascular. They don't have this vascular tissue for transport. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the specifics of vascular tissue in a future lesson, but we have two major types. We have xylem and phloem. The xylem is your water-carrying vascular tissue, and the phloem is your food-carrying vascular tissue. And so these together make up veins. Okay, most people are probably familiar with plants having veins. That's what this vascular tissue is. Well, the mosses, these bryophytes, they do not have that tissue, and so because they don't have transport tissue, they're going to have to be really small in size. You don't see them growing tall because they don't have any way to transport that water and the nutrients long distance. So they're going to be small, and they're going to be very close to the ground. They also are typically going to be close to water or in areas where there's moisture. You don't find mosses in like the desert because they need water. Not only for transport purposes, because they don't have deep roots that can absorb it, but they also need to be near water for fertilization. Okay, now when it comes to just transport, because they don't have these vascular tissues, they don't have these vessels, they just rely on basic osmosis and diffusion, which is why they have to be close to the water and close to the ground. Okay. Now they do have flagellated sperm, so in order to reproduce, they're going to release these swimming sperm into water, at least water droplets, in order for them to be able to reproduce. And this is the only group where the gametophyte is the dominant stage. So most of the time when you're looking at a moss, what you're seeing is the gametophyte. And then at certain stages in their life cycle, they will produce the sporophyte, which produces the spores. And so depending on the time of year, sometimes you can catch the moss in that sporophyte stage. Now here's an example of the life cycle. Now, I do not expect you to know all of the detailed pieces of the individual life cycles, but what I do want to show you is that they all have the same basic pattern. Okay, so here's my 2N sporophyte. All right, in order to get that, you had to have the zygote, you had to have the sperm and egg that were fertilized, and so the zygote grows into the sporophyte produces spores, which then produce the gametophytes, the male and the female, which then produces the gametes. And so this is just a more specific version of alternation of generations. Okay, they do have some slightly different structures, like the protonemata, okay, or things like that, but it's the same basic alternation of generations for all plant groups. Now remember though that this is the only group where the gametophyte is the dominant stage. Okay. All right, our next group, moving up on the evolutionary ladder, is going to be our seedless vascular plants. So that means they now have the vascular tissue for transport. We can see that here. They have the xylem and the phloem. Xylem carries water, phloem carries food, but they don't have seeds yet. Okay, and so this is going to include groups known as the lycophytes, the ferns, which is probably the most common, and then some other fern-like plants like the horsetails and the whisk ferns. Now this is the first group that do have the true root, stems, and leaves, but they're lacking the seeds. So they don't have a protected embryo and a food source in a seed. And so instead of releasing seeds, they're actually going to produce wind-blown spores. Now, we do not have pollen yet either, okay? And so they also are going to require water for fertilization. So once again, you really won't find a lot of ferns growing in the desert because they do need moisture in order to reproduce. It doesn't have to be near water, it just has to be at least have droplets of water in order to reproduce. And then this is the first group where the sporophyte is the dominant stage. So when you're looking at a fern, what you're looking at is the sporophyte. So here's our life cycle again. It's the same basic concept. Okay, here we have our haploid gametophyte producing the gametes, which get fertilized. That produces the sporophyte, which produces the spores, and the cycle continues. All right, up next is going to be our seed plants, and our seed plants include two groups. We have the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So we're going one step up on the evolutionary ladder here. So we now have the vascular tissue and the seeds. And the seeds are important for reproduction because it contains that sporophyte embryo, so it includes the baby plant. It also includes a food source for that baby plant. And then both of those are protected in a seed coat. Okay, now this is going to allow for dormancy. They don't necessarily have to grow into an adult plant right away. Because they have a built-in food source in their seed, they can be dormant for long periods of time. And then in fact, if you go to the grocery store and you get those beans on the shelf, they look like they're probably not going to be very alive, but you could get them to germinate because they're just in a state of dormancy right now. Now another advantage of seeds is that they also can be dispersed long distances. That, you know, depending on the seed type, they can be dispersed by wind or water or by animals or through the digestive tract. So there's all different types and ways of dispersal, which the more you can disperse and spread out, the better off you are having some that are going to grow into an adult plant. Now, something else that you'll find is that in addition to having seeds, seed plants also produce pollen. And the reason that's significant is because the pollen grain houses the sperm, and we no longer have swimming sperm. And so by introducing the pollen grain, we no longer have to have water for fertilization. And as we're very aware of, in fact, this is the season right now, you walk outside and everything's covered in a dust of yellow, okay? That pollen is spreading far and wide by air, and it doesn't have to have water in order to fertilize. Now, we do have two groups of these seed plants. The first one we're going to talk about are the gymnosperms. They are not quite as advanced because they have what we call naked seeds. So they do have the seeds with the protected embryo, but what they don't have, the reason we refer to them as naked seeds, is they don't have extra fleshy tissue around the seeds to protect the seeds themselves, okay? Now, typically your gymnosperms are cone-bearing, which means they have leaves that form cones, and it's inside of those cones that you will find the gametophytes. You will have male cones and female cones, and that is what is producing those gametes. You do have the sporophyte being the dominant stage here. Pretty much starting with the ferns, the sporophyte is the dominant stage in all other plant groups. And we have four major types of gymnosperms. We have the ginkgo, which there's only really one living species today, and it's the ginkgo biloba. Sometimes you may hear that if you talk about like vitamins or, things like little, what are you called? Like if you take vitamins or supplements, there's a ginkgo biloba. Sometimes these are planted because they look pretty, but there's a male and female version, and one of them kind of stinks. The cycads, which these always remind me of like the prehistoric dinosaur movies, but this is a cycad here. The netophytes, which there's not a lot of species of those. And so normally when you think of gymnosperms, what you probably think of are what we have all around here, and that's your conifers, like your pine trees, your spruce trees, things like that, your evergreens. Because we live in the piney woods of East Texas, we are pretty familiar with these conifers. And so here's the life cycle for our gymnosperms. Okay, once again, we have it divided into the gametophyte and the gametophyte and the sporophyte generations, with the haploid and the diploid. So over here, the haploid, this would be our gametophyte stages, and the gametophyte is going to be housed within those cones. You have male and female cones. Once again, they're going to release the gametes, which form the zygote, which grows into the sporophyte, and the sporophyte is going to be that mature conifer or that mature tree, and of course this is going to be the dominant stage. And then our last and most successful group are going to be our angiosperms, otherwise known as flowering plants. And these guys have it all, okay? And they are by far and wide the most successful plant group. About 90% or more of all plant species on Earth today are going to fit into this category, okay? And that's because they have the vascular tissue for transport. They have the seeds, okay? They have the pollen. All right, they also have extra protection around their seeds. So the seeds develop from ovules, which are inside of ovaries. And the ovary is actually what becomes the fruit of the plant. So not only do the angiosperms have flowers, but they also produce fruits. Now, fruits can come in different shapes and sizes. Flowers can come in different shapes and sizes. Not all of them are going to have the big, beautiful, colorful flowers, but your angiosperms are going to include your grasses, all of your bushes. It's going to include a vast majority of your trees, like oak, maple. Of course, because we do live in the piney woods of East Texas, the pine trees would not fit in this category. But a lot of your other trees that are in our area are going to be angiosperms because they produce fruit of some type. An acorn would be an example of a fruit or a seed. And so these guys are not always going to be big fleshy fruits like an apple. They could be pea pods, or they could be like nuts. They could be different types of fruits. Now, the flower itself is essentially a reproductive advantage because it's specialized for sexual reproduction, and it helps to increase reproductive success. And we'll talk more about the flower and its parts in our next lesson. So just a kind of a side-by-side comparison of the gymnosperm and the angiosperm. They're both seed plants. They both produce pollen, but where the gymnosperms have naked seeds, the angiosperm has a protected seed. You can see this additional layer of protection by the ovary. And so here you just have the seed, here you have extra protection around the seed. Now they both produce the pollen, which can spread far and wide. They both have wood-like tissue that can vary. The angiosperms tend to be hardwood, whereas pine is a softer type. Their leaves are different. We have the flat leaves versus the needle-like. We have the seasonal versus evergreen. But really the biggest difference is whether or not those seeds have that extra layer of protection. Where angiosperms have the flowers and fruits, the gymnosperms have the cones. Now the angiosperms can normally be divided into two groups. We have the monocots and the dicots, and that cot comes from the word cotyledon. And a cotyledon is a seed leaf. These are the first little leaves that come out of the seed. They usually are the first photosynthetic leaves, and so mono means one, there's only one seed leaf. Di means two, there's two seed leaves. In addition to the cotyledons, the monocots and dicots also vary in other structures. And here's a list. In terms of testing, I'm not going to ask you specific questions about a monocot versus a dicot, but you do need to understand that monocots and dicots are going to fit under that angiosperm group. Okay, these refer to flowering plants. And so an example of a monocot would be like corn, and so it has one little seed leaf. The roots are fibrous. If you were to count their flower parts, like the sepals and the petals, they'd be in multiples of 3. Their leaf veins are parallel. Think about a corn stalk or a corn husk. If you were to cut open the stem, their vascular bundles would be scattered, and their pollen grains only have one pore. Now, a lot of other monocots are some of your spring-like perennials, things like irises and lilies and tulips and jonquils. If you take a look at a lot of those flowers that are blooming right now, many of those you can look at their leaves or count their flower parts, and they are going to be monocots. Now, your dicots have two cotyledons. They usually have one central root called a taproot. Their flower parts are in 4s or 5s. They have this net-like leaf vein pattern, and their vascular bundles are in rings. And so if you think about any type of tree and the way they have rings, that tells you it's going to be a dicot, okay? But you could also look at some of these other characteristics. And then here's the angiosperm life cycle. It looks a bit more complex. It does have the most advanced reproductive cycle, but you still follow that same basic pattern, okay? And that we're going to have the gametophytes that are producing the gametes. The gametes are going to fuse to produce the sporophyte, and then that sporophyte is going to produce spores that will then become the gametophyte. Okay, we still see our diploid sporophyte generation and our haploid gametophyte generation. So all of these are just slightly modified versions of that alternation of generations. And the last thing we're going to cover is some of the ecological importance of plants. Plants are absolutely necessary in all ecosystems. They're a major food supplier because they are producers, they are able to do photosynthesis. They also play a role in the gases in our atmosphere as they produce oxygen for other organisms. They also absorb carbon dioxide and remove it from the atmosphere. Now, in addition to photosynthesis, they also perform cellular respiration, so we have that opposite exchange of gases there. And so they do help maintain the ozone layer, which is a protective layer, as well as the greenhouse effect. Now, the greenhouse effect is a natural blanket that traps heat and keeps our Earth warm. But if we have too much carbon dioxide or too many greenhouse gases, it could lead to global warming. Now, plants are really beneficial because they actually remove the carbon. And so the more plants we have, the better. The problem is that when we cut down lots of trees, we are causing an imbalance in that carbon dioxide. Now, plants are also important in those biogeochemical cycles that we looked at back in ecology, like they can lose water. And so the transpiration is a big part of the water cycle. They are carbon sinks, so they can store carbon. Whenever they do photosynthesis, they're storing the carbon in those organic compounds. They could also house the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Remember that the plants don't do the fixing, but they may contain the bacteria that do. Some important roles of mosses is that, kind of like a lichen, they can help convert rocks to soil, and they can serve as those, oh geez, sorry, my brain is going blank, in succession. They can be the first organisms that grow in an area. like in primary succession or secondary succession. Peat moss can be used to burn for fuel or hold water, or a lot of times mosses can be used in gardens to help retain moisture. They can be used for biomonitoring. They can look at pollutant levels in plants as they absorb some of those pollutants. And then, of course, roots and mosses can be helpful to prevent erosion. Pioneer species, that's the word I was looking for. These mosses can act as a pioneer species in succession. All right, we also have other roles like many products, and if you just think about your daily life, how many products you use that might come from plants or plant parts or plant chemicals. We use firewood, we use timber to build our homes and many structures. We use fibers in our clothing and things like rope. A lot of our medicines, in fact, about 40% or so, this was according to PBS, but a lot of our medications or herbal type medications are going to come from plant extracts or compounds that we synthesize from plants. We could also use them for dyes, like in the colors of the petals or plant parts. We could use them for pesticides and other oils. And then cork and rubber also both come from plants. And then really something that we're probably already familiar with is plants create habitats for many organisms. So when we're talking about ecology, a lot of organisms live in trees, or they live in the grass, or they live in a bush. They have a lot of relationships with these plant members. And that is going to wrap up our first lesson on Kingdom Plantae. As we move forward, we're going to go into more detail about the structure and transport and reproduction. But for now, that's your general overview. Hope you guys are doing well. I know spring break is coming, but we'll probably hold off on a quiz over this because of spring break. But I do want you to be studying as though there is a quiz, okay? Because you're going to have a lot to know when it comes to test time. Hope you guys have a great day. And of course, as always, let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Talk to you guys later.